Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Jeremy. I wasn't sure anyone was going to come tonight, so thanks for coming. Middle of a long weekend, wet night. Just in case anyone hasn't been to these sessions before, the purpose of these sessions is just to present some Buddhist ideas and practices. And I'll do some talking and do some meditation, and then feel free to ask questions at the end. As I always say, if there's any questions or things I say that you disagree with, then feel free to talk about that in the question and answer session. We have good discussions. Basically what we're talking about is the mind, our minds, how to use our minds to make ourselves happy and make other people happy. That's what we're trying to achieve. And by understanding our minds and recognizing our inner resources. So that's what we're trying to do with meditation. So we'll do some meditation first. As I've mentioned previously this month, meditation is familiarizing your mind with a positive mental object. So that's what we're trying to do when we meditate, to make our minds familiar with a positive mental object. So positive meaning something that makes our minds peaceful, happy, calm, relaxed, as opposed to mental objects which make our mind disturbed. And as you know from your own experience, sometimes we meditate on disturbing mental objects. So, for example, if someone says something insulting to you, you might keep thinking about that over and over in your mind, and each time you think about it, it disturbs your mind and your anger gets stronger, and it sort of builds on itself. So that's like meditating on a negative object or a disturbing object. So we're trying to do the opposite, to familiarise our mind with positive mental object, so that that mental object becomes more familiar to the mind and comes up more easily. We can bring it to mind more easily. Becomes more of a habit, and eventually the positive mind state will be there all of the time through familiarity. That's the goal, even when you're asleep. So that's the idea. And as I've mentioned, the main tools that we use in meditation, firstly is mindfulness, which means remembering the object, holding it in your mind, or filling your mind with that object. So if we're meditating on the breath or we're meditating on compassion, we're keeping that object of meditation in mind using mindfulness. So it's basically remembering it, keeping it in mind. And then the other tool is introspection, which means observing your mind, seeing what's happening in your mind. So sometimes the analogy is used of like the mind is like a body of water, a lake, say, and then there's this small fish sitting in the part of the lake, observing what's happening in the lake. So introspection sometimes is referred to as being like a small fish sitting there quietly, observing what's happening in the mind, and then intervening. So when the concentration starts to wander, the introspection fish says, mind's wandering, you need to bring it back. So then you bring it back to the object. So that's introspection. And then the third thing, which we'll talk about more tonight, is what I call application, which means applying a mental, like a meditation practice to pacify a particular afflictive emotion or a particular emotion. For example, anger or attachment. So when afflictive emotion arises, then you use particular practice to firstly recognize that it's coming up in your mind, and then to subdue it through various practices. And there are many. Okay, so we'll do some meditation now. Firstly, concentration meditation on the breath. And the purpose of this is just to focus your mind, but also has the effect of calming your mind, making your mind peaceful, and also you find that your mind becomes happy when it's focused on one neutral object. So just sit in a posture which helps you to focus your mind. Having your back straight helps you to keep alert, stops you from getting sleepy. And having your eyes slightly open also stops sleepiness, letting some light in, if that's comfortable to do that. Main thing is to be comfortable but also alert. And then just think about your body and relax your body if you're holding any tension. As you breathe out, you can imagine you're breathing out tension or agitation. And then bring your attention to your breath and observe your breath moving in and out. And focus particularly on the point under the tip of your nose, of the breath moving in and out past that point. So mindfulness is holding that point in mind, that object, that mental object. Keeping your mind focused on that. And introspection is observing to see whether the mind is remaining focused or is wandering off to other things. So you don't use a lot of force to hold your mind there. It's just resting on that point or merely observing that object. If you like, you can count your breaths to help you focus. So breathing in and out is one breath. It can be helpful to think of your mind being very expansive, like the sky, but at the same time focused on that object. If you find that your mind keeps wandering, you just keep bringing it back, placing it on the object, and eventually you find that it's easier to keep it there. But also important not to get frustrated if your mind keeps wandering. You just gently bring it back, place it back on the object. So now that we've developed some degree of concentration by focusing on neutral object, the breath, we can now use that concentration to focus on a positive mental object. So we'll do meditation on compassion, love and compassion. So we use concentration as a tool to focus on a positive mental object, to familiarize the mind with a positive mental object. So we meditate on love and compassion by thinking, may all beings have happiness and be free of suffering. And just focus on that thought, or those two thoughts. And it can help to repeat that silently to yourself. May all beings have happiness. May all beings be free from suffering. And you can focus on the people in your life, so you're starting with your friends and family, wishing that they have happiness and be free of all problems. And you gradually increase to include more people. The people you encounter in your life, the people you work with or study with. And then include all the people that you don't know, that you haven't met, the people living in this city and in this country, in the world, in this universe. So you try to make the scope of your meditation as large as possible, include as many beings, including non-humans like animals. And visualize that from your heart that white light or golden light is radiating out and entering into the bodies and minds of all other beings, completely filling them, their body and mind, with the happiness that they're seeking. So again, starting with the people you're close to and gradually expanding out to increase to include as many beings as you can visualize. If there's people you know who are experiencing particular problems, like health problems or mental problems, you visualize that this light is completely removing that and giving them the happiness that they're seeking. So again, we're using mindfulness and introspection in this meditation also. So the object of meditation is all beings. It's a vast object. And introspection is observing to see where the mind is remaining focused on the object. Also important to focus on the people that you don't like, the ones that you consider harmful. Also think of what would make them happy and bring them peace. So this whole visualization again should be like calm and relaxed, but also alert. So you're not using any force, you're just sort of resting your mind on this visualization, on this idea of love and compassion. And by doing that, it's becoming more familiar with the mind. So then at the end of the meditation you visualize that all beings have achieved this state that's completely free from problems, all types of problems and suffering, and is completely peaceful, and is achieved this lasting peace. And then you visualize that the light absorbs back into your heart, and end the meditation there. So I think of a meditation like that as being one of generating a very expansive or large state of mind. It kind of feels very large and expansive to be trying to extend your mind out to think of all living beings. And you can see how that, or maybe you can see how that's kind of the opposite to when we get very focused just on this I and the very tiny things that we can get very upset about. So I think you can see how that expansive mind of wishing all other beings to be happy is kind of like the opposite of that. So that's said to be a powerful antidote or remedy for this problem that we have of focusing kind of obsessively about this one I, this self, and getting extremely caught up in all the minute details of what this I wants and doesn't want. I was having a discussion with someone today, and we were complaining about our Bluetooth on our phone, and then he said, "Oh, this is really a first world problem." You're getting sort of worked up about how our Bluetooth's not working properly. You realise this is really not important in the scheme of things. Okay, so that's any comments or questions about that meditation? Yep. Okay, so just to maybe recap a little bit what I've been talking about. So I have been talking about this idea that the true happiness that we're seeking, we can't find it in external objects. So we've covered that quite a lot. And I think that's a basic kind of premise of most spiritual traditions, that we need to look within our mind for the happiness that we're seeking. And the main reason given for that is that these external objects are external to the mind. So there's no definite connection between the external object and the mind of happiness. So we find that even though we're eating our favourite, most delicious food, it doesn't necessarily bring happiness to our mind. And if it did, then if it was a true source of happiness, the more we ate it, then the more we should feel happy. But we find the opposite is the case. So you can apply that same logic to all external things outside the mind. So that was one idea that we covered quite a lot. So if you really take that seriously, it's something of an inner revolution, I think, because normally we're always looking outside for happiness and also blaming our problems on external objects, on people, on situations, on our work, etc. So in the same way as the primary or true cause of happiness is within the mind, also the cause of our problems is actually within our mind too. So that's also quite a, I guess, provocative, challenging idea, because normally we think of our problems as being caused by things outside, by annoying people, by stressful work, traffic jams, etc. But the idea here is that they are like a condition which gives rise to this feeling in our mind, this frustration or stress or whatever it is. But actually the problem is actually coming from the mind. So in a way that's quite empowering, because normally we think of the external world being problematic and causing us this grief. Why isn't the world nicer to me? If only it was nicer, I'd be happier if everyone was nice to me. But actually, if you understand that all of these problems are generated by the mind, they're actually coming from the mind, then that empowers us to do something about it. So then you might think, well, what about extreme situations, where people are being, like war, people are being killed? How can you say that comes from the mind? So as I was saying a few weeks ago, even in a war situation, people experience it quite differently. Some people find it completely terrifying, while others develop a lot of courage, and others seem fairly, calm about it. You see the different reactions. So you can see how the mind is playing a role in how you experience something even as horrific as war. So that's an important point to think about. Okay, so then if you accept that idea that the main causes of happiness and also problems are within the mind, and then you look within your mind and you try and work out what it is within your mind which will cause the happiness or the problems. And then, so by using introspection, we're looking at our mind and seeing what's going on, and we see there's so much happening in our mind. It's like an ocean with so many things going on, all these thoughts and emotions and ideas, and when we try to concentrate, we find our mind is constantly moving around from one object to the other. So that can be quite daunting to try and look at your mind and work out what it is in your mind which will bring you happiness and what it is that's causing problems. So in Buddhist thought and also other meditation traditions, so there's this idea of positive objects, positive mental objects, and negative mental objects. So the positive ones are the ones that are pacifying your mind, making it more calm and peaceful. And the negative ones are the ones that are doing the opposite. So a good example of a positive object is what we've just done, is meditating on compassion. And it's interesting that the Buddhist claim is that the positive objects are actually based on an understanding of reality, like a realistic view, whereas the negative objects are based on an unrealistic or mistaken view. So that's a very interesting idea, because often we think that, it's really nice to be loving and compassionate, but that's just wishful thinking. Thinking that everyone's lovely, everyone's nice and deserves love is, it's a nice idea, but it's just wishful thinking. But the Buddha is saying that actually that's the correct view of how things are. So if you could see reality, then you would naturally feel loving and compassionate. So he's saying it's based on reality, not just on a nice idea. Whereas a view like hatred or anger is based on a mistaken view. So because we don't actually see people how they truly are, then we give rise to attitudes like anger, jealousy, etc. So the idea is that these are based on a mistaken view. So that's very interesting, and something we need to investigate. Just hold that thought, we'll come back. But thanks for the question. You've been giving me very good questions. Thanks. Okay, so then we've got this idea of positive and negative thoughts. So that then the practice of meditation, as I said, is just to try to make the mind more familiar with these positive thoughts, develop them, make them stronger in your mind and more like habitual, more like a natural part of your way of thinking. For example, compassion. So by meditating on compassion, and then gradually it becomes more and more familiar until the idea is it's sort of like there all the time. So your basic view is one of wanting to help others. That's kind of like a foundational view, and then all the things you do are motivated by that sort of basic idea. Even neutral objects like walking down the street, you think I'm walking, because I want it for the benefit of others, sort of thing, or eating. So you think, well, how does that benefit others by eating? And I guess the idea is to try and incorporate all of your actions into this basic goal of benefiting other beings, as well as yourself. So by eating good food, you can make yourself healthy and live a longer life, and then you're more in a better position to be useful for others, particularly people around you That's the idea. So, as I said before, one of the main opponent forces or opponent powers to this idea, this attitude of self-centeredness, which is said to be like the main problem, the main thing that's disturbing our mind, and then the other things are arising, the other disturbing or afflictive emotions are arising from that self-centered view. So love and compassion is like one of the main opponent forces for subduing or reducing that self-centered view by focusing more on others and less just on this I. So that's like a general, I guess, antidote or a general practice to pacify that. But then there's things that arise from the self-centered view, like attachment, like anger, and there's also practices we can do to particularly focus on dealing with those or addressing those, reducing those. So I was going to talk a little bit about some of those. So we can start, for example, with attachment. So firstly, what is attachment? Because I think it's not well understood in Western thought and Western culture, and it's often mistaken for affection or love. So attachment is defined as this state of mind which is looking at an object, whether it's a person or a thing, and it's exaggerating the good qualities of that object, sort of seeing it as more important or more beautiful or more pure or whatever it is, and then seeking to hold on to that thing, that object. So that's the idea of attachment. And we can be attached to almost anything, but often it's attachment to people, but then also attachment to ideas. You know, you see people getting so attached to a particular idea that they're, willing to die for it. Attached to ideas about ourself, like pride is an idea about the self, about how I am or how I want to be, how I want to project myself to the world, and attachment to an image of yourself. So that's what attachment is. And attachment is said to be one of relatively more difficult to overcome because often it appears as a form of happiness. So that's an interesting idea. And the analogy is used of like a moth being drawn to a candle. So the moth looks at the candle and thinks that's something really beautiful, that flame, and I want to get close to it. But every time it gets close, it gets burnt, so it flies away. And it's experiencing pain from getting burnt, the heat, but then it keeps coming back. It can't resist. It keeps coming back until eventually it just gets destroyed by the flame. And that's attachment, that's the mind of attachment. So it's said to be, it's like that. So our mind is drawn to the object. It's so sort of impressed or overwhelmed by the object, the beauty of the object. It doesn't notice that the feeling of attachment, of wanting that, is actually uncomfortable or disturbing our mind. So that's an interesting idea, something that I think we need to investigate. And you can just bring to mind something that you're attached to, whether it's a person or anything, and just think of that state of mind and ask yourself, is that state of mind happiness? Is it peaceful? So the Buddha is saying that's actually a disturbed state of mind. And then the mind of attachment brings us a lot of problems. And this is also something that I think we generally may not be aware of, but we need to investigate this. So, for example, they're neatly divided into the problems of wanting and not having. So when you're very attached to something that you really want, but you can't get it, whether it's a person or a material object or a position of status or whatever. So we've all experienced that. We're quite familiar with that, wanting something but not being able to have it. A nice holiday, more spare time, being able to sleep in, whatever it is. So that's the problem of wanting and not having. And then there's the problem of having. So even if we possess an object that we're attached to, still there's problems for example, if we're very attached to a person, and even though we might sort of have them, possess them, that we're scared of losing them. If we have very strong attachment, then there's always this anxiety of losing the object. Or if you're in a position of power, you're very attached to it, then you could be constantly anxious about losing that position of power. Or celebrity status. So easy to lose your celebrity status. So that's the problem of having. And also things like overconsumption is also a problem of having. So we have the problem in the world, environmental problems caused by overconsumption, consuming more than we need. So that's another problem. And also we sometimes have health problems because of overconsumption. So that's the problem of having. Then also there's the problem of losing. So when we lose the object that we're very attached to, that's painful. So something we've all experienced. Something that you're very attached to. When we lose it, it's painful. It hurts. So when we talk about attachment, people often say, "Well, isn't that like you're talking about attached to a person? Isn't that actually love? Like, aren't you? Isn't that a form of affection or kindness, being attached to a person?" So we have to be very clear here about the make a distinction between love and attachment, because attachment is looking at that person and thinking what happiness can I get from them. So it's focused on I, and it's not really focused on their happiness. So love is the opposite. You're looking at them and thinking, well, what can I do to make them happy? So it's quite, you can see how it's quite like the opposite. So attachment may not be the best word for this state of mind. We maybe should use the Sanskrit word. I'm not sure what that is. But people often think it sounds kind of callous to think there's something wrong with being attached to a person. But actually the attachment to that person causes you a lot of problems in your relationship with them. Because you want them to be a certain way to fulfill your needs. And they usually don't behave in the way that you want them to all the time. So that causes frustration and disappointment. So that's attachment, and that's the problems caused by attachment. So then let's say we agree with that, and you don't have to, then how do we get rid of attachment? And how do we get rid of all these problems that are being caused by attachment? Is it possible? So the Buddha is saying, yes, it's quite possible, because attachment is based on this mistaken view of the object or the person or whatever it is you're attached to. We can overcome attachment by removing the mistaken view. So as I said, the mistaken view is that you're exaggerating the importance of that object. So one of the first practices for overcoming attachment is to recognize that it's actually causing suffering to your mind. It's disturbing your mind. So that's one of the first things. So if we recognize that attachment is actually a state of unhappiness, it's not a state of happiness, then it's easier to get rid of it. That's the first thing. And it's said that it's only when you achieve sort of more advanced spiritual states where your mind is in a state of bliss through meditation, that's actually, you won't actually get rid of attachment until you achieve that, because at that point you realize that attachment is actually quite unpleasant. It's a form of suffering. So it's said that at that point all your attachment will disappear, because you can see that it's just unhappiness. But because we don't have that sort of, I don't at least have that sort of blissful states of meditation, attachment still appears to be sort of something interesting or pleasant. So we have to investigate that through our meditation. And then the other, some of the other practices we can do to overcome attachment is to focus on the faults of the object that we're attached to. So this is also, I think, quite a confronting idea, like particularly if you're talking about a person that you're attached to. It seems sort of unfair or uncharitable or something to focus on their faults. But it's useful to do. Like, if you're thinking of someone as being like perfect or flawless, then it's useful to meditate on like their flaws. And to identify that that is actually an unrealistic projection that you're putting onto them. So, for example, often we have attachment to the human body, and you can see a human body as being perfect and beautiful, and attachment arising to the body. So then the antidote to that is to meditate on the various faults of the human body. So faults would meaning things like that if we focus on they don't appear to be pleasant to the mind. For example, the waste products generated by the human body. So by focusing on the waste products generated by the human body, it challenges that view that this body is somehow perfect or flawless. And so you find in Buddhist literature these sort of going into excruciating detail of all the faults of the body and meditating all the inner organs and the various fluids produced by the body. Pardon? Excretions. Yes, those excretions. But it's an interesting example of how, because you can see how on one hand the mind is projecting this sort of purity on the object, seeing it as perfect, but then you compare that with the reality of actually what the body is, with all these the parts that make up the body. And you can see how the projection is really not based on that reality. Like even you think of the skeleton, you think of a skeleton, there's nothing, normally you wouldn't regard a skeleton as beautiful or attractive. But everybody has a skeleton within them. So the idea is to challenge the mind of attachment by focusing on the reality of the object and the faults of the object. So then you might think, well, does every object have faults? What about a beautiful flower or a beautiful garden, beautiful house? So then the other faults you can think of is the fact that by experiencing that object, say a beautiful garden, for example, one of my favourite things to do is like go for a walk in the forest, early in the morning, sun's shining, it's beautiful. But then, so how do you meditate on the... Well, firstly, is being attached to that a problem? So you might think, so just walking in the forest, that's making your mind peaceful. Is there anything wrong with that? It's fine. But then you could be thinking, oh, this is so beautiful, this place, and I wish I could stay here forever, or I wish I could feel like this forever, or I wish I could live here. Why do I have to work in the city, stuck in the city, for example, those kind of thoughts. So then this kind of unhappiness comes up. You can't enjoy the forest because you're sort of thinking, oh, it's so beautiful, I wish I could have this kind of beauty all the time, and get attached to the beauty, and you can't, it actually stops you from enjoying it because you're trying to hold on to it. So that's one of the problems, how attachment is causing us problems. And then the faults of the object. So the faults is that if you stayed in that forest like all day and then all night and the next day, eventually you probably find that you get quite lonely, maybe bored with the forest. If you stay for a month by yourself, you might end up hating the forest. You go on a meditation retreat in the forest and this forest is so scary at night and there's no one here, I'm so alone. So it changes in our mind, how it appears to our mind, it changes.
For example, you're no longer attached.
Sorry?
You're no longer attached then, are you? You have ceased to be attached.
Yeah, good question. So then it turns into aversion, which is also a problem. Yeah. So aversion is as much as a problem as attachment. But the aversion is arising because of the attachment. So because you thought that this thing was beautiful, and you've overdone it. Yeah. So it's a similar problem of aversion. It's something your mind is projecting onto the object, and it's not based on reality.
So any attachment is negative, regardless of the object. Even if the object is a good one, so I am attached to meditation.
Yeah. Yes. Good point. Yeah. So can you be attached to meditation?
Well, now that's my mind. One can be attached to meditation.
Yeah.
The question is...
Is that a problem?
That's right.
Yeah.
Is that the problem? I can think of why it would be a problem, because you're effectively isolating yourself from the world, from others, from your children, potentially from...
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. So you can be attached to meditation. So what that means again is you're exaggerating the importance of something. So you're no longer seeing it realistically. So for example, one problem that meditators have, apparently, advanced meditators, is they can get attached to the bliss of meditation. They keep going back to it because it's so enjoyable and kind of get stuck there. So then you're not actually increasing their wisdom. You're sort of getting stuck with the bliss, apparently. Sounds like quite a nice problem to have, but apparently that is a problem. Or you can get stuck on focus on just one particular meditation and exaggerate the importance of that. So meditating on love and compassion is very important, but there are other things that also you need to meditate on. Yeah, sure.
So if you're in the forest and you enjoy the forest,
Yeah.
and you don't think about, I want to live here or I want to stay here longer. So is it the idea that you go to the forest, you have a good time, and then you just go? Can we not overthink things and just go to the forest, enjoy it for what it is,
Yep.
and go home?
Yeah, I think that would, yeah.
Is that what you're saying that we should be trying to do? That that's not an attachment or an aversion?
Yeah, I think that's the idea. Yeah, so that sort of brings up the idea of impermanence. So the experience of going to the forest and feeling that that the happiness in going to the forest, we need to recognise that the whole thing is impermanent. So the going there and the experience, we need to see that it's arising, due to causes and conditions, and just sort of accept that it's arising and enjoy it, but not try to hold on to it. And so, because we see it, if we stay in the forest longer and longer, the happiness is not going to stay with us. So, seeing the forest as some kind of inherent source of happiness is unrealistic. So we're trying to be realistic about the whole thing. And by being realistic, then we avoid these kind of problems of exaggerating the importance of things. Do you see what I'm saying? Like one example was a friend of mine, she travelled up north and had a great time in community in northern New South Wales. Loved it so much, came back to Melbourne, sold up everything, moved up there, bought a house. A year later, she's totally miserable, lonely, too many snakes, and borers in the foundations of the house she bought. All these problems. Came back unhappy. So I'm not criticising her at all, but this is how our minds work. You have a beautiful experience and you project it onto the environment or onto the people or whatever, expect that it's always going to be there, but that's not realistic. Yeah. So we can see how that creates problems, that sort of unrealistic thinking. So we need to recognise that and try to reduce that.
But isn't that part of the journey of life? So this lady thought that she would like to live there, and she took that chance, and not everything in life is going to turn out. Because if you don't take that chance, then she might just stay in Melbourne and be locked down with everyone and not have a good time anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. I agree. I'm not saying it was a bad thing to do. I'm just saying that's kind of an example of how the mind of attachment can lead us into a situation which we thought was going to be pleasant but ended up not being. But as you say, we learn from those kind of experiences, and maybe it was the best thing for her to do. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we just need to be aware that this is going on, and recognise it, and then try to work with it. Yeah. Any other questions about attachment or anything else? Can you see how attachment is quite different to love in relation, like you're talking about attachment to people and having love for people? It's quite different. I think we need to be clear about what's going on when our mind is experiencing attachment towards a person, as opposed to when it's feeling love and compassion. And as you say, attachment arises sort of naturally, like we don't have to put any effort into it. But from the Buddhist point of view, that's just because it's very familiar to us. This state of mind where we look at something external, we think, wow, that's really beautiful. I want to get close to that, or I want to possess that, or own it, or consume it. And but it's based on a mistaken projection that our mind is projecting onto that person or that object.
And parents sometimes overdo the attachment with their kids?
Yeah, I think definitely attachment. Parents experience attachment to their kids, and you can see those problems of the problem of wanting and not having, for example. So some parents want their kids to be more, want to be closer to them or more affectionate. That's the problem some parents have when their kids move away. Or it hurts. The fear of losing children. Some parents are very anxious about losing their children, so that can be even cause mental illness, because your mind can be so anxious about your children. And then obviously the problem of losing your children, even if they move away or they grow up and get their own family and you're sort of excluded, and that can cause suffering for parents because they're wanting to keep their children close to them, or not wanting them to even grow up, wanting them to remain the cute little person that they were. That kind of thing. Yeah, so attachment is definitely a problem in that relationship. It is in all relationships, but also parents. But that's nothing to do with love and compassion. So if you loved someone, your children, and then they met a good partner who was going to make them happy and moved away, and they were happy moving away. So loving attitude, you think, okay, that's great. They've achieved happiness. They're happy with that person. They've got their own life going on. So love can sort of let them go and do their own thing, sort of thing. As our teacher here often says, if you found a better teacher than me, I'd be happy for you. So I'd be quite happy if you went off and found And he said, then he teases, I would not sure you'd be happy if your partner went and found a better partner, whether you'd be happy for them. So you got to ask, do you really? Is that true love or not?
But that is precisely the point of loving freely, isn't that right? The true love
Yeah.
is precisely that. It's that idea of the good old, if you love someone, set them free, much, much harder to say than that.
For sure, yeah, for sure. So if your partner found someone nicer than you, how would you feel? You would be hurt enormously, but then you ask, well, why does it hurt so much? It's because you want them to stay with you. Why do you want them to stay with you?
It's not a failure so much, it's just a natural human reaction. I mean, it's always negative.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you could say, well, that's just natural. That's like, it's natural to want to keep the people you love close to you. But we've got to investigate that, I think. I mean, is there some unrealistic thinking going on there? Like, is it realistic to think that this person should stay with you
Is it
forever?
unrealistic to also expect you yourself not to feel real about it?
So I think it's realistic that we would feel suffering because we have attachment. So we need to accept that. We do have attachment. We've got to be realistic about that. We've got to accept that. We've got to be patient with ourselves, compassionate towards ourselves because we have attachment, but also understand that attachment is based on a mistaken idea and is causing us suffering. So if we can, we should try to reduce it, out of compassion for ourselves as well as for others. But yeah, attachment is strongly sort of ingrained in our mind. The Buddha said it's like oil soaked into cloth, so it's quite difficult to get the oil out of the cloth. He likened that to attachment, particularly because it appears as something pleasant and something even helpful. Often we think attachment is making me happy, but actually it's not. Yes?
Awareness of attachment, how young can a person be to understand that? I think that toddlers and children as they grow up don't have an awareness of how attached they are to their mother, perhaps probably father as well, but certainly love force of mother. And then do they become, I wonder if they become aware of the attachment and have to grow up and detach.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think everybody's different, and I think, some kids are very perceptive and others not so much. But like, yeah, go on.
If we as adults in this room can start to consider attachment and the problems associated with it, how young can you be? Or is there a brain development? I don't know. Maybe
Well, yeah.
thought, if you're not old enough, conceptual thought people couldn't do it.
Yeah, I guess you would say that, but I think everyone's mind is different, and all children are different. So, and some children seem to be able to understand things very, very easily, like compassion, for example. You see, some children seem to be naturally compassionate, and others, not so much. But so I don't think you could really put an age on it. But I think you can teach children, I think, the idea of compassion, like, for example, when they're fighting with their siblings over something, and you say, well, why is that so important? Is it really worth all this pain and suffering? You've got other things that you could maybe just forget about that thing, do something else, let go of that object. Yeah. So practicing generosity is a sort of opposite of attachment. Giving things instead of a mind of wanting all the time. Yeah. But we're the same. I mean, adults are the same. We also need to learn these things through practice. Yep.
At a certain age, wouldn't a kid's attachment to their parents be also linked to a survival need? Like when you're young and you're attached to your parents, you are sort of attached because you can't survive without it.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. So you're saying that attachment serves as sort of a purpose for survival when you're young. So I think the Buddhist view is that if a mind of like an afflictive emotion like attachment, if it's based on a mistaken view, like based on a mistaken idea, then we can say that's natural because it keeps coming up. But it's not. The idea is not that it has to always be there. So by removing the mistaken view, identifying what it is, and then removing it, we can be free of that view. That's the idea. So that applies even to children, even in infants. So there's something arising in their mind where they're seeing their parents as, the protector, and wanting to hold on to them, out of fear or whatever. But that can still be attachment. And then you think, well, is it possible for a child not to have that state of mind? So the Buddhist view would be, yes, it would be possible for a child not to have that. But they could be motivated by intelligence, so they see that I need, protection from my parents. But it's not. It's different to attachment. It's sort of an awareness. Mm.
Surely the age of the child, they will be aware of that as well. So I think it's absolutely correct that when they're young, when they need to feed off the mum, or when they're just starting to walk, or it would be, I think, your problem will be when you got a 15-year-old that doesn't want to walk away from you in the park or something. Whereas, I think children naturally develop this progressive confidence in where at the beginning everything runs around themselves and their parents, and then slowly they explore the world and they start distancing themselves.
Yeah. But I think the Buddhist view is it's not natural in the sense that it has to be there. Like I think you're saying it has to be there because it's sort of like a biological thing. But
I'm saying that, no, I'm not saying that it must be there.
Right, it tends to be there.
It would be natural for a 2-year-old to be hanging around the mum in the park, whereas if she was 18, then you will think, oh, there's perhaps too much attachment.
Yeah. But you can see differences in children even, can't you? So some children are very, very attached to their parents and wrapped around mum's leg all the time. Other children, not so much. They want to roam around and explore. So you can see how the mind is different. Yeah. Sorry?
The question of degree, maybe.
Yeah.
What is
Yeah.
natural or what isn't?
Yeah, but doesn't that imply that it doesn't necessarily have to be there? Because it's different in different minds? Yeah. Mm. So I think the idea of natural is maybe one that we need to investigate. Because some people say we all have this fight or flight instinct. But the Buddhist view is that that's actually just familiarity, with an idea based on this sense of I. And when a threat comes up, we due to mental habit over many lifetimes, we either want to run away from it or we want to fight with it. Because we have this sense of I, sense of other, that other's threatening this I, therefore I've either got to run away or fight it. But all these are just, like habits that are built up in the mind. That's the idea. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Take a look at the other two verses. Very easy on the website.
Oh yeah, there is on YouTube. Yeah, Tara Institute YouTube. Yeah.
No report.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for your interest. How are we going for time? Nearly done. Any last questions about attachment? Yes. Generally, yeah. To themselves, or yeah, no, it's a fair point. So you're saying that the monastic training where you take a child young age, some are young as 6 even, and so they go away from their family, live in a monastic institution, and so you're saying that could be harmful, or they could miss out on something like the affection of their parents, for example, their mother. Yeah, like our teacher, Geshe Doga, he said when he was young, he went to the monastery, I think about 6, and he missed his mother enormously. And he knew that if his mother would only come to the monastery when he's needed new shoes, so he'd always scuffing his shoes on the rocks and dragging his feet around so he could shoes, so she'd come more often. But he often talks about that and how eventually he says he he sort of describes it as becoming like stronger, I guess, in himself. So he doesn't really regard that personally for him as a negative thing, in the long term. But I guess it's different for everybody, like everyone's mind's different. I've spoken to monks who have said that, found being a monk very difficult, and others find it very easy, they really enjoy it. So I guess it depends on your mind. And the Buddhists say it sort of depends on familiarity over lifetimes. So if you've been a monk for many lifetimes, or a female monk, nun, then it's comfortable, familiar, it's not a problem. But for others, it's a problem. I remember when I got interested in Buddhism and I was talking to my teacher about becoming a monk, and he just said, no, you're just going to be miserable and you'll make everyone else miserable, and after 5 years you'll give up and you might give up meditation completely. And so it's also difficult in this society, I think, that there's not much support for monastics. Walking around with robes, you get people whistling at you and yeah. So, it's difficult. Yeah. All right, so we're a bit over time, so thank you very much for listening. And next month we have Kathy, who's a very serious meditator and much more hardworking meditator than me, so you can ask her lots of questions about meditation. Thanks for listening.